Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Susan Hickman. I'm the interim president and CEO of Regenstrief. I'm delighted to have all of you here today and to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Amy Knopf, who is both a colleague and a friend of mine. Dr. Amy Knopf is an assistant professor in the IU School of Nursing. Her clinical background includes primary care at a federally qualified health center in Washington, D.C., as well as direct care and trial drug administration to patients enrolled in phase 2 clinical trials at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. These two clinical experiences led Amy to an interest in public health and disease prevention. After earning an MPH and PhD at the University of Washington, Dr. Knopf developed a program of research that centers health equity and intersects several areas of interest, including HIV, bioethics, and COVID-19. She has received more than $3 million in federal funding and has served as an expert for the World Health Organization, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. I'm really delighted to have her here today to talk about some of the work she did with the National Academies, as well as her own work, and she'll be presenting on building research equity, recommendations for improving representation in clinical trials. Join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Knopf.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me today. So the first slide is just a reminder for how you can log in to get CMEs for this session. So as Dr. Hickman mentioned, my primary goal today is to talk about the work of the National Academies on a recent panel that I participated on, and the report is 400 pages long, so I have a terrifying number of slides, but hopefully we'll do our best to get through them and to not make them super boring. My third grader did let me know that these slides are boring, so I'll apologize in advance. She's always super helpful before talks. Again, this is for a CME certification, and I just wanted to mention that I do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I think it's really important to acknowledge that I was invited here today as a cisgender white woman to talk about issues around health equity and representation in clinical trials. And I really like this example of it's called the academic wheel of privilege, which is sort of a clumsy title. But I think it's important to think about, how I am here is not necessarily a reflection of my own, special qualities or, intellect. It's really a combination of my own work, but also a path that was easy for me to get to this place. And I hope that the work that the Academies is doing and that IU is doing will make the pathway easier for others. So I wasn't sure if you would have access to my bio because I was admittedly late in sending it. But just to recap, a lot of my own experiences as a registered nurse led me to an interest in this work, and in particular, the way that my experiences working as a clinical trials nurse, administering phase 2 drugs and being part of caring for people after surgical procedures really influenced my understanding of clinical trials, but also the lack of representation in clinical trials. And I worked at NIH straight out of my undergrad experience. And excuse me, I'm having a bit of an asthma flare, so I apologize for clearing my throat all the time. One thing that I noticed was I lived downtown in DC, and I took the subway to Bethesda, Maryland, to the NIH campus, which is gorgeous and very much like this building. Beautiful, well-resourced, and a lot of the patients who were enrolled in those trials were white, upper class professionals. And it just became clear to me that the drugs and procedures that we were testing were being tested in populations that did not at all reflect the city around us or the United States in general. And after a time, the discrepancy in what I observed around me in terms of resources and identities and the folks that I was working with and the resources there just became like very bothersome for me and a bit untenable. And so I pivoted entirely to working in a free clinic that primarily served unstably housed adults, many of whom were suffering from severe untreated psychiatric disorders, substance use disorder, as well as chronic illness and infectious diseases. And in particular, at that time in Washington, D.C., this was around 2003, there was a very high prevalence of HIV and a very high incidence. And so a lot of my patients could not access therapies and also were dying of secondary infections while they were living with HIV. And that really sparked my interest in public health. And I just want to give a nod to some of the training that I had at the University of Washington, because I think it really prepared me for a lot of the work that I do today and shaped my own understanding of my experiences and how they were very different from others. I did a Master of Public Health in the Community-Oriented Public Health Practice Program, which is sort of a mouthful, but it was a really unique and small program that was entirely conducted using problem-based learning and really had founding principles that were rooted in social justice. This was like 15 years ago, 16 years ago. And so they were really sort of ahead of the curve in making that part of the academic experience and part of our training. And then I came here after my PhD and did a postdoctoral fellowship in the School of Nursing and a traineeship in adolescent health in the School of Medicine. So as Dr. Hickman mentioned, my areas of expertise are really kind of three things, but with roots in issues around social justice as they affect health equity. So I mentioned, experience and work in HIV prevention, this work that I did in Western Kenya as well as in the US, and also looking at adolescent health and applied bioethics and how all of those things intersect. I built a program of research that sort of went stepwise from HIV prevention to sort of recognizing that part of HIV prevention, particularly in the era of biomedical prevention therapies, required participation in clinical trials. And adolescents' participation in clinical trials is strongly affected by issues of consent and ethical regulations. And so that led to a series of other studies around the role of parents, around the sort of ethical conflicts that we see when we think about the roles of institutions, investigators, funders, parents, and then the teens themselves that we're trying to enroll. And so these are some projects that I've been working on. Happy to touch base with folks later about that. But just to give you a sense of sort of where I'm grounded as a scientist and how that relates to the work that I did with the National Academies. Okay, so now I will get to that work. So I was part of an ad hoc committee that was assembled to meet a congressional mandate to study the issue of representation in clinical trials, particularly its health and economic effects and what could be done about the lack of representation. So there were 12 other members of the committee who brought a variety of expertise, and each of us is now responsible for communicating the results and recommendations. So I'm here today in that capacity. But I should mention it was about 18 months of really strong collaborative efforts from the folks who are listed here. So I've included this statement of task here, and I just want to acknowledge that the committee really grappled with language. This is the congressional mandate, but I'd just like to acknowledge that using the term minority groups really sort of misses the mark. And what we really need to talk about is the effects of systemic racism and other forms of oppression and how they have created health inequities as well as lack of representation. However, this was literally the statement of task. So the committee was really tasked with four things: to review the health and economic benefits of increasing representation, to review existing literature on factors, both barriers and facilitators to representative enrollment in clinical trials, to look for and highlight promising or effective programs for improving representation, and to identify more inclusive policies and recommendations to increase representation and, more importantly, to improve health equity. So here's really the argument for why representation matters and why this study was important and all the time that was spent on it. So when we have underrepresentation of people of color, of women, of people who identify as Latinx, we really are compromising the generalizability of clinical research. We're also affecting the risks and benefits of participation. Lack of representation costs billions of dollars, sorry, hundreds of billions of dollars, and I'll get to where that figure comes from in a moment. It hinders innovation. It also compounds low accrual and contributes to trial failure. That was something that we found in the study. And I have been a part of studies that moved slowly or sites had to be dropped because we just couldn't accrue enough people that met criteria. May lead to a lack of access of effective medical interventions. And again, just from my own work as an example, we see this with adolescents. If we think about the role of pre-exposure prophylaxis, the first drug that was approved for pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV was approved for use in adults 6 years before it was approved for use in minors who are at risk of HIV. And we know that many HIV infections, sort of the bulk of incident infections occur in people's 20s, which means that their risk and that's the age when they're diagnosed. So they probably acquire HIV in their late teens. So by missing 6 years of the potential to have this drug available to minors, there were tens of thousands of infections that could have been prevented. So there are very real life implications and lifelong in this situation implications when there are delays in access. Poor representation also may undermine trust. And I think, we can look to the most recent examples around COVID-19 enrollment, vaccines, people's sense of trust in those trials and willingness to engage in them. And then again, all of these things lead to health inequities in the populations who are currently underrepresented. So each individual on the committee had very specific roles, and I'll just lead with saying that the economic modeling was not a role of mine. So I'll do my best to explain it, but certainly there's a lot of detail in the report itself, and I'll be happy to send out the link for folks to that. But one of the charges of the committee, a big component of the work, was to model the actual cost to the United States when we do not have representation in clinical trials, and how that affects health inequities, which then affects disability adjusted life years and also time in the workforce. So the committee used a future elderly model, which basically follows a representative cohort of Americans over time, generating snapshots of their chronic health conditions. And we looked at specifically 3 different chronic health conditions that are very prevalent in the United States and also have a lot of health inequities. So those were diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease. And using this model, we basically looked at 5 underrepresented groups in clinical trials. So people who self-reported as non-Hispanic, Black, female, and male, Latinx females and males, and non-Hispanic women in the population. And so we looked at a model that basically compared these groups relative to white males who are typically enrolled in research, and looked at their estimated life expectancy, disability-free life expectancy, and working years that would be gained if clinical trial enrollment and representation improved enough to eliminate some disparities. So I'll just very briefly talk about some of the results of that work. If disparities due to clinical trial enrollment were eliminated for diabetes, we would have a nearly 1-year increase in life expectancy for these groups, and also a year in life expectancy, disability-free life years, and about 6 more months over the course of a lifetime engaged in the workforce. And these results were very similar for heart disease, so roughly a year increase in life expectancy as well as disability-free life years, but slightly less additional time in the workforce. And again, very similar results for hypertension. So, what does this mean, basically? And at the end of the day, if we could eliminate all of the disparities that occur due to poor enrollment. The value for just these three conditions would be close to $20 trillion. So, it's not terribly realistic to think that we could resolve all disparities in these three conditions. So we looked at, okay, well, what would happen if we could just reduce health disparities just very modestly, and found that would still be worth billions of dollars. So just as an example, if 1% of health disparities were alleviated by improving representation in clinical research, we would have between like around 40 billion in gains for diabetes and 60 billion for heart disease alone. And again, these are just three examples of chronic diseases, and not the full spectrum of diseases that might be improved with clinical trial representation. So, we also wanted to know where we are relative to where we want to go. And it was really difficult actually to even measure. One of the charges was to look at representation in clinical trials, but data reporting practices across agencies made it really difficult to do an accurate comparison. We do know that thanks to changes in regulations and NIH initiatives that more women are enrolling in clinical trials. So we have seen improvement there. However, there's been close to a decade of efforts to improve engagement of people of color in clinical trials, and we just really haven't seen much progress. That said, it's admittedly hard to really look at enrollment by racial identity and ethnic identity, as well as gender identity across FDA, NIH, and then other sources of funding in clinical trials, including industry trials. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the barriers we identified in our report. There's an entire chapter on barriers to representation and another chapter on facilitators. But I think the committee recognized that we know a lot about barriers. We talk a lot about barriers. We talk a lot about disparities, but it's sort of time to move past that and look at facilitators and ways that we can actually improve. I will say that when we looked at individual and community factors, these are really frequently cited as the problem. So, for example, I think many of us have probably heard the argument that, oh, it's just really hard to get people to enroll, or maybe heard these terms like hidden populations, vulnerable populations, hard to reach populations. And I think based on our engagement with community partners and with a variety of experts over the year and a half, there was really strong pushback as well as really strong evidence that that's actually not true. Lack of willingness to participate is often given for as a reason for poor representation, but the literature suggests that actually people of color, so Asian, Black, Latinx individuals, and American Indian and Alaska Native populations are no less likely and no less willing to engage in research. However, what we did find is that clinicians and investigators spent far less time actually attempting to recruit these people, even when they were seen in the same clinical context and had the same potential to be recruited. It's not that the people that we think of as hidden or vulnerable, which is really sort of code for disenfranchised and marginalized through, again, systems of oppression. It's not that they don't want to participate, it's that we sort of assume that and we don't try. And we also found that, distrust and mistrust, which is a whole other set of, a whole other conversation. These do matter and they do have effects, but they are surmountable. And I think we often sort of excuse ourselves from some of the work that we need to do under the guise of like, oh, there's so much mistrust or distrust in this particular community. But I think it's important to point out that is something that we can address. There are definitely research landscape factors, and we spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I think there's some good content in the report. But I'll just say that even from the start of individual research studies, so how do we develop our questions? How do we develop our target enrollment? What resources do we devote to recruitment? That is one layer of issues, and it just sort of keeps going when we think about we talked a lot and we heard from a lot of experts, I should say, in addition to the committee members to sort of get all the glory. Over the course of a year and a half, we engaged a lot of community partners, representatives from community groups that are doing really strong partnerships with academic institutions. These folks weighed in. We also held I think, 5 public sessions over the course of a year and a half to get input from experts and also from the US public and other stakeholders. But one thing that we found is that academic institutions really don't incentivize, and also funders don't incentivize the kind of work that it takes in order to really enroll people in these studies. And I think one way, we can think about that is just when you apply for funding, when you get it, and when you're applying for tenure, it's a really tight timeline to turn around. And that doesn't always work when you're trying to do real, solid, community engaged work and when you're treating people as partners. IRBs can also pose a barrier. I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but one of the key issues that came up for us as we were looking at evidence is, a lot of times incentives are a big issue. That there is this tendency, and we had representatives from OHRP and FDA come and talk about IRB related issues, but there is this sort of perception that really providing people with compensation, with childcare, with transportation could be coercive. And we really leaned into that instead of looking at this as, when we are asking people to participate in research, particularly if we're talking about people who don't have unlimited leave, who don't have flexible jobs, we are taking money away from them. We are taking time away from their families, from their caregiving duties. And we need to recognize that, and we need to compensate people for that time. And so really broadening how we think about compensation and what counts as coercive was a really important point. And again, funders, thinking about what drives scoring criteria from our funders, what drives timelines, what's considered productive, what's considered impactful. And then medical journals, we talked quite a bit, excuse me, about the role of medical journals. What do they publish? What do they not publish? When we have null results, or when things are messy and complicated, or sample sizes are small, those trials don't tend to get published. And our chairwoman for the committee is now the executive editor for JAMA. And so she's already put in a number of new policies to really look at how trial enrollment is reported, how data from the study are reported, and really making a concerted effort to allow for the publications of community engaged work, which isn't always as splashy as some of the big clinical trials. So thinking about some of the facilitators, so we conducted a qualitative research study, some de novo research, and talked with some teams that had been very successful in enrolling diverse populations in their trials. And we asked them to identify factors and sort of talk to us about what they had done. And there were basically 8 key themes of that work. And one of them was just starting with intention to achieve a representative sample and assuming that it's possible. So again, this is kind of going back to how do we think about the folks who we're trying to engage? Are we using terms like hidden or marginalized or hard to reach? And are we starting from a place where we're just sort of assuming that, we aren't going to get a diverse sample? I think one of the things that we learned, and we heard from some scientists who truly spent 5 full years investing in the community and being a partner to them, actually using private funds, because this isn't the kind of thing that you can typically get federal research dollars to do. But they spent, 5 years before they even started talking about the research they wanted to do in the community. And so this was something that came up with a lot of folks that we interviewed. Also, this issue of establishing a foundation of trust with participants and with communities. So one of the study team members that were interviewed suggested that the end goal really ought to be full parity between academic and community partners. And I think that that's really captured in this quote here, which I won't read, but it would really look like sharing the effort to write grants, which I think I know I have not done well in the past. I'm not sure how feasible it's been for others. But it's going to take time and money, and really thinking about how do we distribute money when we do get funding. Also really anticipating and removing barriers to study participation. So some suggestions included offering study visit times that are after hours, and thinking about how we approach recruitment and data collection. And so this was a comment from someone who just took feedback from participants I think initially they were planning to do everything in REDCap, but there were some people who didn't want to do that, and they were able to do their data collection via phone. And actually, some people did paper surveys, and that's what they preferred. So really thinking about how can we be flexible and meet our participants where they are, and with the methods that they prefer. There was also a real emphasis placed on building a robust network and identifying all potential stakeholders. And that stakeholders should be really broadly defined. So we're not just thinking about individuals affected by a health issue, but also caregivers, family members, peers, religious leaders, and also political figures, which I think is something that we're doing a little bit better in general. And also people underscored the importance of helping everyone understand, the roles of scientific and societal expectations when we're doing science. Because I think, even in my own work, it can sometimes be hard when you have expectations or funder expectations that you have to keep moving, and when your community partners or your local PIs have difficulty getting that done. And I think that this quote from one of our participants in the interviews is just so important, and really resonated with a lot of experiences that, there is this sort of language around the importance of health disparities and inclusion, but it doesn't really necessarily drive the scoring criteria for NIH and for other funders. And that's one thing that the committee wanted to acknowledge and change. So also thinking about who's on your study team to ensure that you're aligning with the populations that you're trying to work with and your end goals. And I think that, for me personally, it's been very important to think about who I'm hiring and what my expectations are and how I think about things like authorship, what people's individual roles are and how those roles and the products of the research can help influence and further their careers, rather than just sort of thinking, okay, this staff of people works for me and I'm going to just assign them tasks. I think we have to rethink, how do we think about a study team as something that should promote justice and equity along with the work that we're doing. And then also just attaining resources. So I think there's a really great example in the report from Gina Green Harris, who really was able to get a lot of local and foundation support. She was one of the scientists that worked with the community for 5 years. Her work is amazing and is pretty heavily featured actually in the report. And so I think that, this comes down to, again, how do we distribute funds? How do we think about the money that's going to community partners and to individuals? And that as we engage more with community partners, we need to be aware, that issues around budget and the amount of money that's available and awareness of that money and their share of it needs to be considered and factored in. Okay, so I'll move forward to some of the conclusions. That's sort of the findings. And then, of course, we had to think about, okay, what's the sum total of these findings and how do we move forward from here? So first, I think that the committee really wanted to underscore the urgency of improving representation and research, and that this isn't, sort of a long-term goal. Is really an immediate need, and it should be an immediate goal. And so some of the recommendations that we developed are things that actually are already being done, could already be done by us, by our institutions, by our partners. And that improving representation really requires investments and money. And so some of the recommendations are really focused on regulatory bodies and FDA, for example. How do we financially support these efforts? That there needs to be transparency and accountabilities, and this comes even from the start, as I was mentioning, like the research questions that we're asking, the teams that we're assembling. How are we accountable to community partners, and how are we ensuring that the work that we're doing, for example, does not perpetuate structures of oppression and marginalization. That this is really the responsibility of everyone, and I'll talk about sort of what does that mean. I think for each of these conclusions there are pretty specific recommendations and courses of action, but that all of us who are engaged, whether we are journal editors, scientists, funders, reviewers, reviewers of grants, reviewers of articles, that we need to be accountable and responsible for issues around representation, which again, at the end of the day, it's not just about representation in clinical trials. The point here is that what we have found through our economic modeling and through examining effective programs, is that improving representation leads to better science, leads to better access to new therapies that are effective, and therefore would improve health equity or reduce inequities. And so we have to rethink, what does the balance of power looks like? I mean, this is kind of some things that I've been talking about. Who controls what gets published? Who drives or makes decisions around scoring criteria and things like that? And who has a voice and who's at the table in scientific meetings and in grant planning? So I'll talk through some of the recommendations, and they are fairly wordy, so I'll try to just summarize them, but know they're completely available to you online. But there are a total of 17 recommendations, and some of them are immediately actionable and others will take time. So the recommendations around reporting really hit at the finding that it's very difficult to actually measure representation. And so one of the first recommendations is that HHS would establish a task force to coordinate data collection and have better accrual tracking that is publicly available across different types of clinical trials. So one of the issues being that, when you try to compare across FDA, industry trials, and NIH-funded trials, it's pretty much impossible to understand what enrollment and representation looks like. And that's especially true when you sort of move down into particular institutes and particular funding streams. And I will say that this is actually already in the works now. There's already been congressional funding allocated to address this first issue, and that progress on this issue would be reported annually to Congress. And that the NIH would improve its reporting guidelines. So for sure there are reporting guidelines, and that's an improvement, but again, they're very difficult to measure. They're not terribly clear, and they're not always transparent or easily exported and analyzed. I mean, as a group, we had a lot of difficulty doing that with a massive team, and it just couldn't be done. And so thinking about what do individual scientists need to know, it's pretty much impossible. So calling on the NIH to improve that. And then again, calling on journal editors and publishers to require information about the representativeness of trials for submissions. And I know that Dr. Bivens has already implemented some of this for JAMA. And so what that looks like is not just reporting out like who enrolled in your trial, but what was, who did you say you were gonna enroll? And being very specific about that. And then the third piece, so who did you say you were going to enroll? Who did you actually enroll? And also, how does your enrollment reflect or not reflect the distribution of the health issue in the population? Okay, in terms of accountability, we wanted the FDA to require that study sponsors submit a detailed recruitment plan no later than at the time of investigational new drug and IDE application, and that it should explain how they will ensure that the trial population, again, when we talk about representation, we had to think about how do you measure that. And so rather than using, say, like a US Census data or, a population level, we really wanted for representation to be tailored and measured by the distribution of the disease in the population. That NIH would formally incorporate considerations of representativeness and score driving criteria. So this, really gets back to this issue that a community person brought up, that basically there is this idea that we should be working on disparities, but in reality, that doesn't always happen. That OHRP and FDA would actually work with local IRBs to assess and report the representativeness of clinical trials. So local IRBs are tasked with ensuring that our research design is scientifically sound and protects human subjects. And so we're calling for ethical regulators to think about representation as an aspect of what makes for sound science. And that the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services should amend its guidance for coverage for evidence of development So really thinking about what CMS is willing to cover, that these trials and studies are actually recruiting and retaining folks who do reflect the population most affected by the health conditions under study. So thinking about this issue, we call for improved funding and improved financial support for these initiatives. So what does that actually look like in practice? So we are asking for Congress to direct the FDA to enforce its existing accountability measures, but also develop a task force to study new incentives for new drug and device trials. So there are a variety of sort of discussions around what that would look like, and those are available in the report. Again, that CMS should expedite coverage decisions for drugs and devices that should be covered in trials based on representativeness of those trials. And that community providers should be incentivized to enroll and retain participants and reimburse for the time and infrastructure required, which is not currently part of coverage. And that the Government Accountability Office should assess the impact of these reimbursements, particularly of routine care costs that are associated with clinical trial participation. So getting back to this issue around how do we provide compensation or remuneration to clinical trial participants? So this is again sort of where IRB issues intersect, and that OHRP, NIH, and FDA have a real clear role to provide guidance to local IRBs on what does equitable compensation look like. I think that there is a tendency to think that to sort of conflate equal and equitable, and that there are some people. So, for example, someone like me who has a flexible job, I'll get paid whether I'm at work today between 9 and 5 or I'm working later. What I might need in terms of remuneration in order to participate in a trial is different from another person who has, more of these marginalized identities. And so we want to rethink what does equitable remuneration look like and provide that guidance to IRBs. And that all sponsors of clinical trials and research should really think about the money that is being provided to compensate. So one of the ideas was, if you're NIH or FDA and you're funding a particular study, that you would allot more money for engagement. So if a study, demonstrates that it is recruiting a representative sample, that study might get additional funds, along the way to support their efforts to recruit and retain a more representative sample. Okay, and then there are education, workforce, and sort of larger partnership issues. So thinking about how we conduct clinical trials, and I sort of talked about this a little bit, thinking about who's on the team, who's in leadership positions. And I will say, I do think that there are a lot of organizations, including this institution, who are really attending to this right now. And that academic medical centers and large health systems institutions really need to start thinking about what it takes for their faculty and professionals to do this sort of work. What does DEI work? It's not just seminars and trainings. It's really about honoring the time and the contributions that may look different. They may not be as quick. They may not have the same sort of large scale results that efforts, that are traditionally used as metrics of success. And then, providing training in engagement and DEI principles and making that a required part of human subjects training for investigators. And also calling on HHS to invest in community-based research infrastructure that would improve representation in clinical trials and clinical research. So a lot of the, some of the issues are, where do we locate research? And a lot of times it's located, we can look here at our, in our own state. Research and clinical trials tend to be located within large cities where these infrastructures exist, where you have large academic medical centers. But thinking about how can we work with, for example, federally qualified health centers, how can we work with rural providers and develop infrastructure that would actually allow for more representation in these trials? So that is the end of content and recommendations. And I'm happy to talk through some of these recommendations or just sort of the committee's work or any comments that you have.
Thank you so much, Amy. We really appreciate you sharing this work. And I'm curious, part of your, not to put you on the spot, but I know part of your kind of call to action following was to share the findings. I'm curious, in terms of work with like the IRB on campus, if you've actually engaged any conversations with the IRB around these issues, or if there's ways people can help support that work. I think there's a lot of interest in this
Mhm.
issue from our investigators and faculty more broadly. And so I'm curious sort of where that's at and what your thoughts are about how to help move that forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. So frankly, because I was on a leave of absence, like pretty much right after this report came out, and we were authorized to discuss it, I haven't had a lot of opportunity. I do think that it's really important. Especially to work with the IRB. So I'll say that the IRB focus recommendations were specifically my contribution to the report. And so it is something that I really want to work with locally. And my experience with our IRB has been nothing but stellar. I have a really good working relationship with Beth Johnson in particular. And we talked about, sort of what would the implications look like. And I definitely need to follow up on that. But I would turn it back to you and say, what suggestions do you have, for sort of thinking about what does this look like on our campus? I think the IRB things in particular, I think one of the things that I actually in the report and some of our sort of highlights throughout the report, I actually did point to IU because I think that Indiana is not always considered a stellar exemplar of this sort of work. But I do think our university is really sort of on the leading edge, and we think about rethinking what counts as success, particularly for tenure. Like for example, in the School of Nursing, we have new criteria for promotion and tenure that include recognition of efforts and actually require them to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice in our research, in our teaching, in our work. And real measurable efforts for that. And I think the university is also looking at that as a whole. Another example that I pointed to in the report from IU is the Grand Challenges initiatives and the way in which our institution is, sort of putting its money where the mouth is, thinking about how do we invest in the communities around here, whose tax dollars we receive and whose land we occupy, what are we doing? And I think that was a real shining example. But that said, I will turf it back to you and say, or to everyone, how should I better engage with our institution and our state on some of these issues?
Okay, I'll jump in again.
Okay.
It does seem like, there are a lot of people, again, interested in this,
Mhm.
even though people are being quiet. I wonder about pulling together people who have interest in this area to drive that forward,
Mhm.
and so that it's not all on your shoulders to push it forward. But, I think that we may well have investigators, for example, within the Center for Aging Research who'd be interested in
Yeah.
participating in that kind of work. I wrote down your uh, the recommendation about DEI training as part of human subjects research. That
Mhm.
seems like that'd be something that'd be fairly straightforward to
Mhm.
implement and would really sort of lift the bar in terms of the foundational knowledge that all of our research staff and faculty have in engaging in research. But again, I think and I'd be happy to talk with you more about this later about how we pull people together at the institutional level
Mhm.
to engage with the IRB, who are amazing, but certainly doesn't need to all be on your shoulders. So there may be other ideas too, and there may be comments online as well.
Yeah. And I'll just put forward, as an assistant professor, I don't have a lot of clout, so, or like historical institutional knowledge. So I would definitely welcome partnerships, especially from those of you who do have more clout and do have more connections and ties within the university.
We do have a couple of questions online. The first one is, has there been any work around community-based education describing the components of clinical trials and the benefits of being enrolled?
I'm not sure if the question is like focused locally or just more broadly, but I'll take a stab and say yes is is the really short answer. And I think that some of the examples, again, in the report, there are sort of like some highlights of programs and of investigators who've done that really well. So I will point again to Gina Green Harris, highly recommend reading her work, looking to her as a real model of what does that look like and how do you help. I'll kind of put it both in both directions. You know, investigators need to understand community values and what it's going to take to actually be considered a true partner in research. And then also our community partners also need to understand, you know, what are these pieces, like what does it look like to be part of clinical trials? What does it look like to have to meet certain goals and expectations of funders? But I do think that, you know, there are really good examples. Another person who I think, you know, this is sort of a little bit tangential, but thinking about how do you address issues of mistrust, distrust. Consuelo Wilkins has also done amazing work. I'm happy afterwards, you know, I could send it to you, Michelle, some of these papers and talking about that I think were really important and instrumental in the community's work and also just in my own sort of development as a scholar is interested in these issues. I think that she does a wonderful job of talking about mistrust and distrust. Where does that come from? What does it mean? And how do we address it? And how do we not use it as an excuse for doing work that is not really in the best interest of the community and of issues around health equity?
The next question is, in the barriers you described, and then this person puts quotes in their own words, how hard is it to do the right thing, end quote. And in the recommendations, you talked about a lot of things, but I did not catch too many that will make it easier for researchers to do the right thing without heroic efforts on their part.
So I think there are a couple of things. So I think one is thinking about, well, maybe maybe I should start with I think that person is right. I think that it will take a lot of effort. I'm not sure it takes heroic effort though. But I do think that some of the things that we can do, just pointing back to what Dr. Hemman just said, you know, how do we work within our own institutions? How do we lobby for some of these changes? I mean, I think one thing that we could think about, you know, is how, as an individual researcher, how do I allocate the budget that I do get? You know, how am I honoring my community partners? How am I honoring the staff? Who am I hiring? You know, just as a very short example from my own work, you know, when I was doing work in Kenya, one thing I really admired about the principal investigator who was training me is that the lion's share of her funding actually went to community partners and went to local investigators. And, you know, I think that there are things that we can do as individuals that maybe we think of as heroic, but really are just sort of fundamental to putting these things into practice. I think also thinking about, you know, working with our IRB, thinking about the distribution of incentives. You know, what does that look like? And I'll say, you know, just as an example, in a study that I'm running right now, we asked for funding from PCORI to provide one tablet, a set of you know, earphones for we're doing online work exclusively online, and hotspots for internet connectivity for every participant that we would be enrolling. However, not everyone needs that, so we didn't just use that money and provide it, but we did make sure that it was available. And so I think that's the kind of example of, you know, where do we think about equality or sort of equal distribution of resources versus providing things to people who actually need them, and then using that money in other ways. So, for example, kind of shifting money around, you know, which is usually permissible within reason for grants, and instead paying a young person who's going to be present and working with us and thinking through data analysis. rather than sort of assuming every single person needs one of these tablets in order to make it fair for everyone. Instead, we can kind of shift things around and provide resources as they are needed, rather than just assuming we have to give it to everyone. I'm not sure if that addressed the question whatsoever. I think it was a valid question. I don't claim to have all the solutions.
Thanks for the presentation. One question I had is, I know you were focused on clinical trials, but in your conversations or in the report, is there anything in there about implications for real world evidence studies or observational studies where we're using, say, electronic medical records to look at populations and what we should be doing in that? A lot of the work that we do here is in that vein, not necessarily always a clinical trial. And so I can certainly see opportunities where we could look at issues around disparities and equity in looking at sort of observational studies as well.
Yeah, that is a great question. We actually spent, I'm not sure how many hours trying to figure that out exactly. I think the short answer is that we specifically did not address modeling studies and use of electronic health records in particular, largely because the specific charge for the statement of task was clinical trials. That said, in all of the work, we use the NIH definition of clinical trials, so it doesn't necessarily have to be, like an RCT or a drug trial, but also observational behavioral studies, other forms of research. But there was a big question around the type of research that you mentioned, and sort of an acknowledgement that we would sort of be diluting the power of the study and the recommendations that we could make if we tried to include like the whole world of possibilities. And I think that there was also a very strong acknowledgement that that sort of research almost like deserves its own treatment, because what it would look like to make improvements in how we conduct those studies or report them out is really sort of different than what we were charged with looking at. But I think it's a great point.
I'll just say I saw a real intersection when you were talking about how difficult it is to identify this information, right? How is the data stored? What health data standards are being used? And that actually intersects with a lot of the work that we're doing within the Institute about how to conceptualize and create those variables with existing data or identify them. So I think there are a couple places where it connects in.
And that would relate back to, the charge for NIH, FDA, to create clear guidelines around how we do that. And I know it's been a huge discussion with my research team and with other colleagues, lots of things, how do you represent? I mean, most people don't think of themselves in just like this one dimension. And yet the way that we need to report out, for funding, for funders and for other purposes, and now, for journals is like, in literally in a little cell in a table that, is really a poor measure of who we are as people. And so this is a little bit of an aside, but one of the things that we've been trying to do as a team and thinking about is, okay, we have to do this table, we have to report it for, for journals, for funders, but within, the text and within the narrative, acknowledging, when we have someone listed as multiracial, here's the breadth of how people identify. Or in my own work, I have a lot of participants who identify as non-binary or as trans or as genderqueer, for example, and trying to capture that, both in analysis and in reporting is difficult. So I just put it into the narrative below, when we say other, this is the sort of the world of answers that our participants gave. Kind of an aside for what you're saying, but sort of gets at the difficulty of actually practicing, some of these things. All right, well, thank you so much for attending, and I'll send a couple extra resources if that's okay. Okay, thank you.